Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Professional Development Series session. My name is Amy Page. I'm a Quality Assurance Specialist with the National Center on Early Childhood Quality Assurance. I have the pleasure of facilitating today's session, which is the first in a series of 3 sessions we are hosting this fiscal year. I want to take a moment to acknowledge my colleagues from the Quality Center team that have assisted in the development of this session or providing support for the call today as well. Many thanks to Tatiana Garafola, Shannon Smith, and Christy Lewis. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the center's website, along with the slide deck, once required remediation process for accessibility has been completed. Due to the enormous interest in the session, we anticipated high attendance today. Therefore, we have participants in listen-only mode in order to reduce any potential feedback or unintended background noises. We will have some polling activities and also encourage you to use the chat feature in Zoom to engage. You can do that by clicking on the chat feature in the toolbar along the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, it may be under the More section with the 3 dots, and the chat feature should launch there for you. Please reach out via the chat feature if you're experiencing ongoing technical issues during the session. But please note that we may have limited capacity to address issues while the webinar is running. We'd like to take a moment now to find out a little bit about all of you, our audience today, and review the agenda for our time together. Before I dive into the agenda, we'd like to have everyone respond to a couple of check-in questions. So you should see a polling feature that launches. This first question here just simply asks, what's your primary role in licensing or the early childhood system? So please select the question or the role that best describes your role. And then if you scroll down in the chat box, in the poll box, you'll see a second question that also asks how many years you have been affiliated with licensing or the early childhood system. Give everybody a moment to respond to that. Looks like we've got many responses coming in. Thank you for taking the time. It looks like the majority of our respondents in our audience so far is licensing field staff, so surveyors or consultants or frontline staff, followed by licensing administration staff. Great. Along with other early childhood quality support folks. Have some federal staff and national partners on as well. And then my goodness, it looks like almost half of the audience has 11 plus years of experience in licensing or the early childhood system. So we definitely have a wealth of experience and knowledge on the call today, it looks like. If we can go back just one slide briefly, please. Thanks so much for the responses to the poll. And we are going to, having just a small technical glitch with the slides. Just one moment, please. Thank you. We're thrilled to have a wonderful colleague joining us as our guest presenter for this session. Dr. Amie Lapp Payne will be sharing a very insightful presentation with us, focusing on the importance of balancing technical assistance and enforcement as part of a strong licensing foundation. There will be opportunities to interact during the presentation, but we also encourage you to jot down questions and key takeaways throughout, as we will have designated time available following the presentation for questions and comments. Since this is the first session in our series, we would also appreciate your feedback about today's session and have built in time for you to provide us with your thoughts. As we wrap up the call, we have some upcoming events that we will provide information for as well. So with that, again, we appreciate your participation today. And now it is my great pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Amie Lapp Payne. Amy?
Well, hello, everyone. I hope you are doing well from wherever you're sitting. I apologize for this quick interruption to the team, but the facility where I'm sitting right now has just turned on some massive air conditioning, and I want to make sure that there isn't a sound interference. So I'm hoping that folks can hear me okay. Okay, well, I'm glad you can hear me. If you see me shivering, you'll know why. But I am so glad to be here with each of you today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for that incredible introduction. Y'all, I have to tell you, I'm the mother of two 11-year-old boy-girl twins. They keep me going, and I think they keep me younger than I actually am, so I'm good with that. I'm also the founder of Algae Wraps and the president of Child and Family Solutions, including your Child and Family Solutions Consulting. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. You know, when Christy, Amy, Shannon, and the ECQA team gave me the opportunity to share with you what I've been learning over the past few decades from NARA, as well as my experience in the field, and from you, so many of you that I've worked with out in the trenches of our childcare licensing field every day, I was so humbled and certainly challenged. So I want to say a very big thank you to Amy, Shannon, Tatiana, Christy, your entire team. You have provided incredible support, and I'm very grateful. You're such a joy to work with. Okay, before I get started, I just want to ask everyone just to reiterate what Amy said. Please, if you have questions throughout the presentation, use the chat and go ahead and put them there, and we'll try to have the team review them and respond to them at the end of the presentation. And some things I'll be addressing throughout the presentation just in terms of what I'm actually presenting. And finally, before I share with you what I've been doing professionally over the past few years, I really want to take a moment to acknowledge what each of you has been doing, especially over the past 18 months. You were and you are quite literally supporting the backbone of our country by ensuring the health, safety, and well-being of children and providers in out-of-home care, even when that meant potentially putting your own at risk. And I just want to thank you. I see you and I appreciate you. For more than 25 years now, I've had the privilege of working with and serving kids and their families across the country in a variety of ways. From research on children's social and emotional adjustments to designing and administering policies and programs, especially licensed childcare and pre-K programs at local, state, and federal levels. But regardless of the role, I was consistently working to ensure children's safety and well-being for their minds, bodies, and souls. And what has always brought me the most joy throughout my career is directly interacting with children and families and with professionals within our field, applying the research that is taking what we know and making it what we do. That is why I feel so privileged to serve as one of the founding members of the NCECQA's licensing expert panel. Over this past year, I've been helping parents and educators calm and comfort their kids throughout COVID-19. So I wrote a book, 7 Tips to Calm and Comfort Your Child, Seeking Christ While Conquering COVID. In the past 3 years, I've been working on developing a wearable therapeutic comfort object that helps calm and comfort all kids, even those with special needs and heightened sensitivities, when they're overwhelmed and hurting. So I invented the Algae Wrap. And most pertinent to our discussion together today, 10 years ago, I served as the consultant who worked with many masterminds in our field to write Strong Licensing, the foundation for quality early care and education system. So you may be wondering why a paper written 10 years ago still has bearing on what we do in licensing today. But let me tell you, do you know what I find most fascinating about that? It's still true. It still works. Strong licensing and the principles and practices that make it so are still the strongest foundation for a quality early care and education system. And that is why balancing technical assistance and enforcement as part of that foundation are so important. With this in mind, before we dive into the material together, I want to do a quick pulse check on our own personal knowledge about the history of licensing and see where everyone's at. So at this point, we're going to introduce a Zoom poll. Let's look at this first question. We're gonna have about 3 questions and we're just gonna take about 30 seconds total to answer them. So just trust your gut and go for it, okay? When was the first child care licensing law passed in the United States? 1796, 1885, 1925, or none of the above? Can you go ahead and respond? The poll disappeared, I'm seeing in the chat. The poll, no poll, the poll disappeared. Okay, everyone's telling me they don't see a poll, it's disappeared. The poll disappeared, the poll has vanished. Okay, so I think what we'll do at this point, since I'm not sure why no one's seeing the poll, I see the poll, is just go ahead and tell you what the options are. And again, it's 1796, 1885, 1925, or none of the above. I am going to go with B. I hope some of you chose B. In 1885, in the state of Pennsylvania, early care child care centers, or what they called day nurseries back then, existed, and I quote from the history papers that we could see, to protect poor children or children whose mothers worked in war-related jobs. All right, let's look at the second question. Has there ever been a set of federal regulations for child care or daycare? Yes, no, or not sure?
Amy, it does, pardon the interruption, it does look like people are able to access the poll now. We do have responses coming in.
Good.
There may be, our apologies for anyone that's not able to access. There may be some variation if you're joining via a mobile device versus computer. So as many of you that can, please chime in. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I see you all taking a moment to go ahead and answer. Some of you can see it, some of you can't, but those of you who can, yep, go ahead and engage. Okay. I'll give you just a few more seconds to see that. All right, let's go. So on number 2, has there ever been a set of federal regulations for childcare or daycare? The answer is yes. Yes, so for those of you who guessed yes, you're right. Do you know when? It was 1968. They were called the Federal Interagency Daycare Regulations, or FDCR. It took place during the Johnson administration. That's when the federal government implemented the FDCR, and then just a few years later, they implemented new FDCR rules. Then they had to suspend them when they discovered that most states weren't even meeting the original FDCR requirements, and that took place in 1971. Finally, we look at our third question. By when were all U.S. states required to take responsibility of regulating childcare? Looks like most of you guessed 1975, almost 50%, about 50% of you did. You were close. The 20% of you who guessed or answered, maybe you knew, 1980, you are correct. In 1980, the federal government again adopted new FDCR rules to ease staffing ratios in favor of group size, which had a better link to the research with children's positive outcomes. But then the regulations were never actually implemented. And in that year, the federal government stopped regulating childcare altogether, leaving responsibility to the states. So good job, well done. I hope you learned something new. I know that I did when I started looking at the history as well. Okay. We're trying to get our slides back. There we go. Here's a quick snapshot showing childcare milestones over the centuries, again with the history within our own country. And while you're looking at them, let me share this with you. In 2003, I became the new Child Development Program Consultant for the Division of Licensing Programs in Virginia under the leadership of the late Carolyn Stevens. She was absolutely brilliant. If you had a chance to meet her, you know this, as well as a tireless advocate for quality licensing, as well as for the National Administration for Regulatory Administrators, or NARA. During my first 2 weeks in my new position, other than meeting my new colleagues and trying to figure out how things worked in Virginia and how they differed from North Carolina and Alabama, from whence I had just come, Carolyn had me read and read about the history of childcare and especially the history of licensing. She would always tell me that we must know where we've been to figure out where we're going, and we also need to think about how best to get there. So I appreciate this graphic put together by Childcare Aware. that depicts the history of childcare in our country from the original childcare nannies as far back as the 1500s up to present day in 2021, showing Congress having passed the American Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief package designating $39 billion toward childcare. No matter how challenging licensing and specifically enforcement strategies may still be today, we really have come a very long way. And yet there is still so much work to do. So let's get started. What would you say is the primary purpose of licensing regulation? Go ahead and put it in the chat. I'm going to share with you that the primary purpose of licensing regulation is monitoring and enforcement. That is how we establish and enforce the requirements that do what? The answer is twofold. First, prevent children from harm. And that is both immediate harm as well as cumulative. Immediate in terms of children's health, safety, and the hazards that are present to them in their environment. Yes, keeping children safe, just as you're saying in the chat. And secondly, as part of that prevention, cumulative. What is cumulative harm? It's the loss of time, the loss of experiences due to a lack of having these enriching experiences, promoting exploration, physical development. So again, it was just with the brain, language, social, emotional, and physical development. That's from preventing the immediate and cumulative harm. But secondly, it is to promote children's healthy development. Each of these aspects of development through interactions takes place with their interactions with teachers, with peers, through their interactions with the environment and with the materials within it. So all together now, and this is quite a mouthful, the primary purpose of licensing regulation is monitoring and enforcement of early care and education environments that prevents harm and promotes healthy development. I would say that every one of us who is dedicated to protecting the health and safety of children should know this, believe this, and make it what we do day in and day out. And I believe that that's why you're here today, because that is what you're doing. So thank you. Now that we know the purpose of licensing and what it serves, let's look at how it has evolved over time. We already learned that the first licensing law was established in Pennsylvania in 1885. And about 80 years later, the first federal set of requirements, FDCR, in 1968, to ensure that children would be protected from harm. But who wrote these? Well, it was developmentalists like me. They wrote the requirements, but then they quickly realized that these high-cost requirements could have unintentional consequences, including fewer children cared for and fewer parents working. As a result, they drafted, and I quote directly from the federal report, a set of ambiguous, unenforceable, and unenforced goals that had little practical effect on the operation of childcare programs. In other words, they were meaningless. Although they had the best of intentions, they established requirements, but they could not enforce them. So I'm asking you, was the primary purpose of licensing upheld under those conditions? No, it wasn't. So then we look ahead to in 1989, where another federal report included a new definition of state licensing standards. And it described them as only a floor beneath which no provider who must meet state requirements may operate. They are not goals or agreements on what quality means. So you see quite a separation there. Then in 1990, the National Resource Center for Health and Safety in Childcare and Early Education, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Public Health Association, all of this work led by our own beloved Rick Feeney, the father of the 13 indicators, published the first ever set of Caring for Our Children National Health and Safety Performance Standards for Early Care and Education Programs. These were a draft set of model standards to protect the health and safety of children in childcare settings. Does anyone know whether and or how these same standards are used in licensing today? Feel free to put your comments in the chat. I'll tell you, those of you who are in the field and those of you who are sitting in the policy offices, wow, it's amazing what happens when we work together. Our policy team members use these standards as evidence-based research to draft quality care requirements each time your state undergoes a periodic review. They are extremely helpful, important, and useful to protect children from harm and to promote their healthy development. And to every one of you who helped with the drafting of these at any time, and especially to Rick, thank you. In 1993, NICHD, that's the National Institute of Child Development, underwent the National Study of Early Child Care and Youth Development for the first time. They examined numerous facilities all over the nation and over 1,300 children and families. And what did they find? You know what they found, that a majority of child care offered in the US was lacking in quality, especially for infants and toddlers. Then, just about a decade later, you see that licensing is defined at the national level once more as a preventative measure to protect children from harm. Now in 2002, a few years later, you'll see the National Center for Early Development and Learning define licensing as the first line of protection in out-of-home childcare settings in the United States. It intends to ensure that care provided is good enough to do no harm to children, that the building is safe and sanitary, and that adequate learning experiences and caring relationships are provided to children. However, NCEDL also included recommendations to improve requirements for center and family child care and to use additional strategies that lead to higher quality care and education for children. In addition to child to staff ratio and group size, remember FIDCR back in 1968, they included staff turnover and compensation, as well as staff education and specific training in child-related fields, and also director competency. They also mentioned that states need enough staff, that's licensing staff, to adequately enforce these standards. So that was 34 years later, finally. Then they go on to include that research demonstrates the value of safe and sanitary practices in the physical environment, but also emphasize the need for positive, nurturing relationships and child-directed activities such as exploration, enriching, and meaningful. So now you're starting to see that licensing and recommendations for quality early care and education are included in the same breath. Then 9 years after that, NARA puts the monitoring and enforcement purpose of licensing together as a strategic way to promote children's optimal development in a model, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And then in 2011, again with NARA, this is when we published our paper, we mentioned that licensed childcare requirements and their effective enforcement are one of the more critical and strategic sets of program standards that we have to protect and nurture young children while promoting their optimal development. Given all that has taken place over the past 150 years or more, I want to ask you, how has licensing history impacted licensing today? Let's just think about it. We went from absolutely no enforcement in 1968 to having enough staff to adequately enforce in 2002, to intentionally writing into statutory provisions and agency policies and establishing a structured continuum of enforcement to position its use of sanctions as a progressive enforcement system. That's the model I'm going to show you in a moment. That was in 2007. And of course, as a side note on childcare programs themselves, we also have incorporated aspects of quality care and early education environment into licensing requirements as well. So what I want to show you then is this model that I talked about, what took place in 2007 that really sort of changed the course of licensing in terms of enforcement and how we look at it. It's the pyramid entitled Types of Enforcement Actions, originally created in 2007, but I am introducing today a model where this is refreshed. And what we're presenting is to incorporate the more recent research on effective licensing as a strong foundation into your thinking. But first, I want to share with you a quote from our strong licensing paper. Our nation and its families are experiencing profound ongoing shifts that suggest licensed childcare programs may be more important now than ever. These changes include the market growth in employed mothers, the increased understanding of the long-term significance of brain development in the first 5 years of life, and in return, on children's subsequent school readiness, the rapid transition to a technology-driven, knowledge-based economy, and the implications that all of these changes have for our nation's current and projected demographic and economic conditions. And we wrote that in 2010. It was published in 2011. That's a full decade before COVID hit. So how much more critical and highly discussed is childcare for our families in our nation than now? This is why what you do is so incredibly important, and how you do it is even more important. And it's why having a strong licensing foundation, including strong statutes, strong enabling requirements, and strong effective enforcement, is critical to protecting the health, safety, and well-being of children. The focus of our discussion today is on the strong enforcement piece of the licensing foundation. Specifically, we will address where technical assistance and other enforcement actions occur along a continuum of enforcement options, and how we can balance the use of these strategies to ensure a well-functioning licensing agency that consistently performs with excellence. So here in the middle, look at this slide, you see, okay, you've got the dashed circle, but I want you to focus on the pyramid in the middle. That's the original model. And written by NARA and the Muskie School of Public Service out of the University of Southern Maine. They created it with the enforcement strategies from least restrictive on the bottom, these are the preventative and corrective strategies, to the most restrictive at the top, terminal sanctions, and in the middle, you see the intermediate sanctions, to enforce compliance with licensing regulations and ultimately to protect children's health and safety. So you can use the chat or raise your virtual hand to show how many of you have ever seen the pyramid in this graphic before. I have to tell you that I hadn't seen the pyramid, and I've read countless papers about licensing, but that one I hadn't seen because it was published in 2014 when I saw it. Okay, so many of you haven't seen it either. Well, guess what? We're all learning something new today. After reviewing recent research and incorporating principles from our strong licensing paper, this is how I like to think about not only the enforcement actions continuum, that's a mouthful, but also the contexts in which this strong enforcement piece of a strong licensing foundation takes place. In our paper, we talk about continuums including 3 levels: prevention, intermediate sanctions, and forcible closure sanctions. But just to be clear, this last level is the same. Forcible closure or terminal sanctions, it's the same. So again, you've got the base, the middle, and the top. So let's walk through this together, and we're going to describe this progression and balance between technical assistance and other enforcement actions. Do you see how technical assistance begins right there at the bottom? It says compliance monitoring, technical assistance, training, consulting, violation with corrective action plan. That's where it is. In the middle, we move to intermediate sanctions. These are slightly more intrusive enforcement actions. The intent here clearly is to resolve the problems as quickly as possible, as soon as you notice them, by giving programs a chance to resolve the non-compliance issue right away, so that neither of you has to resort to or experience more restrictive sanctions. These intermediate sanctions, of course, allow the program to continue to operate with a plan for how they will comply, but also give states options and flexibility for how they might respond to a wide array of circumstances. Finally, at the top, in the dark green there, you see we have terminal sanctions. However, I would like to suggest adding at least one more element to this graphic, and that is teachable moments. I also included best practices along the bottom because we must be using best practices throughout each of the decisions that we make and each of the enforcement actions that we take. But let's look at teachable moments. Do you see on the left-hand side in the dark green going along the base of the pyramid all the way up to the top? Technically, these can be referred to as teaching-based, prevention-focused enforcement strategies. Although we are going to address this in greater detail in a few minutes, For now, let's just say that although we begin with technical assistance as the base of our pyramid, it really doesn't need to end there, and it shouldn't. I would submit that there are teachable moments or opportunities for technical assistance throughout every level of enforcement action, including those that are terminal. I think this is a great graphic to help us visualize the many different tools we have available to us as we are supporting providers to fully comply with licensing requirements and to help them understand not only what must be done to deliver safe, healthy, quality care, but equally important, why it matters to the children they are caring for. This is a great chance for us to take a moment to think about everything we've just reviewed together as we consider how we will determine which types of enforcement actions or strategies to use and when. So go ahead and jot down any questions or comments you have, anything that comes to mind, either on your own note taking or in the chat so we can see them. And with the time that's available, we're going to look at them together, some of them together today. I just wanted to give you a little mental break to do that. Okay. How many of you have ever been focused on one major priority in your licensing department only to find that that seems to suddenly have shifted to something else? I love this graphic that Amy found for us, because do you see in it where each of the little balls are? Have y'all ever seen that on someone's desk? And you can't help it. Like, it's like a magnet. You're just drawn to it, and you pick up one little ball and you let it go. And what happens? It knocks into the other ball, which then creates a chain reaction, knocking all the other little balls, right? And then at the end, the last ball pops out and boom, 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 swings back the other way. Well, for those of us who have been in licensing for more than a minute, I think most of us can agree that over time, the pendulum may swing from one side to another. And within the midst of administrative shifts and priorities, our work and how we do it may also change. I know that I have experienced this myself in a variety of different states. Ultimately, however, as long as we are adhering to the best practice principles foundational to strong licensing, we will still keep children healthy and safe. We will still support providers. We will still engage the community, and we will continue to strive for excellent agency performance together. One set of examples, and I think it's a great set, is just how the use of enforcement actions has changed over time, comes from the 2014 paper published by ECQA. From this paper and from our own work, we know that changes in enforcement actions can result from a variety of factors, including increased emphasis on enforcement, the number of licensing staff available to monitor and follow up on compliance violations, or changes in the number of licensed providers. Of course, the paper also referenced that the settings varied and included non-licensed care, exempt programs, family, friend, and neighbor care, and the like, and noted that some states, certainly by definition, allow for care to take place outside of licensed programs and home. But in this paper, 9 states were interviewed using a written survey and telephone conversations with licensing administrators. Some of you perhaps participated in that. Of these 9 states interviewed, 4 states noted decreases, while 2 states noted more enforcement actions during 2014 in comparison to their own past. So for the 4 states that showed decreases, we're talking about Washington, Utah, Ohio, and Oklahoma. Let's look at Oklahoma first. In Oklahoma, they noted that its use of more severe enforcement actions had decreased because consent agreements were being used more often. Consent agreements led to facilities correcting violations so they could remain open. Washington indicated that denials of initial licenses and revocation of full licenses had decreased, perhaps because of an improved provider orientation process, as well as the technical assistance being offered. Then in Utah, they also reported that the number of negative enforcement actions had decreased as a result of better education of providers, but also credited better educated staff and a more consistent accurate, and effective enforcement process. And recently, just from sitting on the national panel, licensing expert panel together, I know that Utah has shared about how it's offering a variety of types of support for all care types, including providers who are not licensed. And Utah reps, perhaps you can tell us more about that at the end, or put in a comment in the chat that might be reviewed at the end of today. And then in Ohio, they reported that a decrease in the number of revocations took place and said that it was due to the increased use of court settlements and programs voluntarily surrendering their licenses. On the other hand, we have two states that showed increases in enforcement actions. So that's Florida, where they shared that the implementation of a consistent progressive enforcement model statewide that outlines specific enforcement actions that must be taken when a provider meets the defined threshold for administrative action is the reason for this change. And in Georgia, the increase was credited to a renewed focus on keeping children healthy and safe. For example, a heightened awareness and sensitivity around safe transportation and preventing children from being left in vehicles. In addition, they noted that the state's increased emphasis on achieving a better balance between monitoring and providing technical assistance to gain greater compliance from programs. So of course, I want to note that there may have been significant changes since this time administratively, as well as with regard to specific policies within each or even all of the states that we mentioned, since these interviews took place over 7 years ago. If you are representing one of these states today, would you please consider sharing a quick example of whether the use of enforcement actions has changed? And if so, how since 2014 until now? You could just put it in the chat. Regardless of which way the pendulum swings within any given administration or as a result of specific policies, some things stay the same. From decades of work performed by NARA and by state licensing agencies, we know that effective, high-quality licensing, strong licensing, consists of at least 3 distinct components: strong enabling statutes, strong program requirements, and strong enforcement within the licensing agency. Although there are numerous strength indicators or principles that reflect best practices for a licensing agency's regulatory performance, including enforcement, today's focus will be on enforcement itself. So things like adequate funding, executive and legislative support, effective management and leadership, and systematic methods are necessary to have in place, just not the focus of our discussion together today. Okay. Remember the types of enforcement action pyramid we just saw a few slides ago? Well, we're going to look at this together again and pick it apart a little bit more. In the original model, it's just the pyramid in the middle, but today I want to suggest that perhaps another element could be added to this pyramid and this refresh model, and that is the context. So remember how we added the teachable moments there on the left-hand side throughout each level of enforcement action? And we just mentioned the critical necessity of best practices that you see underlying the foundation underneath. Now we're going to acknowledge the type of context necessary for us to enforce well. What I mean by context is the expectations and environment that are in place, and we want for those to be healthy. What else is going on in terms of the foundation and supports that are in place for our licensors, as well as the qualities and characteristics of the relationships that we are establishing between licensor and licensee, so that our licensing staff can exercise professional judgment throughout these enforcement actions? So let's take a moment to look at each piece of this updated model as an adaptation of the original. Starting with the upper left-hand corner, do you see that light green circle there? You see the components of a strong licensing foundation that we just discussed: statutes, requirements, and enforcement. And then at the bottom right, just move your eyes diagonally downward, you see quality licensing requirements and appropriate enforcement. Again, adequate staffing, training, and funding. So it's no surprise that a licensing agency must be adequately staffed, trained, and funded to provide the infrastructure necessary to put strong, quality-directed licensing requirements in place and to appropriately enforce them. However, beyond the infrastructure that we need, What context best supports our licensors, licensing, and licensees as we operate from a strong licensing foundation to adequately determine which strategies to use and when? What I want you to do now is look at the dashed circle surrounding the pyramid. This dashed circle, notice it's not solid, represents an appropriate relationship set of boundaries that are permeable. That means that individuals can move in and out of the relationship to get what they need, and yet there is still a unique connection between them. Specifically, we want to look at how we establish these relationships and how we leverage them as a strength to exercise our professional judgment. So do you see on the right-hand side, we put healthy, trusting relationships, and on the left-hand side, I put professional judgment, because these are how we're going to achieve these, right? The context matters. So how do we do that? First, I'm going to recommend we do two things. Start with heart by establishing healthy relationships. And secondly, trust your gut. Analyze the data to look at the patterns and use your professional judgments. Of course, it's a little bit more detailed than that, but let's work this out together. Okay, why start with heart? What do we mean by that? Here, I mean create and maintain healthy, trusting, and mutually respectful relationships within your staff, with your providers, and most certainly with parents. Then let that model be an example of other relationships, like we want all providers to have with the children and families they serve. Recognize that teachable moments occur throughout, and when we start with heart, truly believing that the vast majority of providers want to do right by children, but some may lack the skills and resources to do so, we can provide them with TA as a preventative corrective strategy, and even teach the provider to see and address precursor conditions, patterns, and causal relationships in violations, as well as to emphasize management accountability. In other words, there is likely a way to figure out what happened, how they got in that situation, data points along the way that consistently showed the same problem over and over, and how not addressing that issue ultimately led to an even bigger, more dangerous issue. Finally, caring enough to extend grace while ensuring that we point out how they are ultimately responsible for correcting this issue and restoring the health and safety of children in their care. It's an art and a gift that I hope each licensor has. So why take the time to provide TA? Because it's the right thing to do. By providing technical assistance, we are not only teaching providers what to do and why it's important to children's development beyond compliance alone, but we are also showing them that we believe they can do it and that we are willing to provide or connect them to the resources necessary for them to be successful. But they are the ones who must choose to make it happen. When we set and maintain these appropriate boundaries, we are indeed establishing a healthy relationship. We are starting with heart. In other words, we give providers the technical assistance and support necessary to help them understand and meet licensing requirements. And we do so in ways that avoid creating dependency on the inspector or licensor to find the problems or solutions. Things like sharing information, connecting with local resources, and taking action to ensure children are safe and in healthy environments per the state laws and requirements are all examples of support and technical assistance. So think about just those few that I mentioned. There are many, many more. In which of these TA examples do you see as the greatest opportunity to help providers understand the why of specific compliance issues? You can put it in the chat. I think it's share information, especially as it pertains to child development. Let me give you an example of a healthy relationship, one that is trusting and mutually respectful. Many years ago, I was a newly appointed director of a nonprofit AA, the highest quality, childcare center in North Carolina. As a 23-year-old, not even a full 2 years out of college, I had a ton of energy, vision, commitment to children's rich learning experiences, and a whole lot of great ideas. But what I lacked was a lot of experience, especially with licensing. And my licensor let me know just how real these requirements were and how I was the person responsible for meeting them. I remember her first visit. Y'all, she stayed for 8 solid hours. Apparently, there were numerous requirements of which I was unaware. For example, we had a slight problem with our nonprofit organization in our retrofitted building that used to be for junior high and had a new use for preschoolers. Don't get me wrong, everything had been replaced, inspected, and approved and was at the right height and level for the children. However, we had a little issue ensuring that our 4 and 5-year-olds were always under sight and sound supervision when they really had to use the bathroom that was at the end of the hall and not in the classroom. But having a teacher go with them meant putting the other teacher and the rest of the kids out of ratio when a floater or I myself was not available. So that was the problem she identified, or one of them. She told me that I needed to propose a better solution. She was right. I can't tell you how creative we were trying to be with everything from walkie-talkie interception in the hallway to large contoured bubble mirrors at the end of the hall. Yes, seriously. Nope, that wasn't going to cut it either. She let me know that I needed to solve this problem, and she explained why the other options wouldn't work. They just weren't good enough to fully protect the health and safety of young children during those few unaccompanied minutes. So my team and I just had to keep going back to the drawing board. At the time, I felt like I could have used a little bit more on the technical assistance end for other possibilities or potential resources and would have loved a slightly gentler tone. But let's face it, she had the understanding and meeting requirements piece down, along with making sure that I was not dependent on her. And the grace she offered was in taking the time to point out all of the issues and giving me a timeline in which to correct them. And because, with the exception of this violation, children were indeed healthy and safe, the risk of immediate harm was very low, and the risk of cumulative harm relative to their relationship and learning experiences was pretty much non-existent. She exercised her professional judgment, trusting that I would take care of each issue immediately without her having to move on to more punitive actions that might have been necessary under different circumstances, especially without a healthy relationship in place. And guess what? We eventually figured out that by moving my assistant's, the floater's desk, she kind of did lots of different things, right, to the end of the hallway and at the entrance and exit right in between the girls' and boys' bathrooms, we were not only providing the kids with constant sight and sound supervision when their teachers were not available to go with them, but by doing so, it also created a place and a face where parents could immediately be welcomed upon entry and exit, and my assistant could actually have her own place. It was a win-win on every level. Now, even though I have to tell you, I didn't necessarily feel like that when she left that day. And y'all, I'm just going to tell you, I cried like a baby. I felt like I had failed, but she gave me what I needed to keep moving forward. Now, regarding the health of my licensor's relationship with me, we must ask ourselves, could we trust each other? Yes. Each party did what we said we would do. Her job was to hold me accountable. And believe you me, she did that in spades. My job was to meet the requirements, and I did that. Okay, so I didn't ace the inspection my first time out of the gate, but I listened to what she shared. I understood what needed to be done and why, and then I worked to create a solution to meet the requirements and to be in full compliance. So let's ask ourselves, were we mutually respectful? Yes. I have to admit, I was never so nervous in our childcare center as I was on that day. You had better believe I was respectful. I mean, I felt like I was being questioned by a police officer, and I was so afraid that I would say or do something wrong without even meaning to. And honestly, although I would have preferred a slightly softer touch, she was certainly respectful. Intimidating, perhaps, but respectful nonetheless. And dare I say, excellent in ensuring that all children in my care were going to be kept safe. What did I learn from this? I learned that I could trust my licensor, and she learned that she could trust me. She and I had a common goal, ensuring the health, safety, and well-being of each child in our care. Each licensing requirement must be met, and especially 100% sound and sight supervision. Finally, no matter how incredibly rich the open-ended exploration and learning experiences we provided for our kids were, and no matter how nurturing the relationships between our teachers and the children in their care were, if we couldn't ensure their total safety, it wasn't enough. And ultimately, she was there to be sure I understood that and took appropriate action on it. Well done, Miss K. Well done. Okay, so you might be thinking, fine, Amy, great. That's doable with preventative and corrective actions, but can I really do that when having to exercise more punitive enforcement actions like terminal sanctions? Yes, even with sanctions, there are opportunities for teachable moments, for grace, and most certainly for professional judgment. We describe this tension and balance with technical assistance and the most restrictive enforcement action in our NARA paper. A license is a covenant between the licensee and the state. Both parties are legally and ethically obliged to keep their bargains. It is incorrect to view a sanction as a punishment or as an accusation that the sanction provider is a bad or a guilty person. A sanction is simply one of two things, either an action to try to restore or enforce the terms of the original bargain, or an action to terminate a bargain that was not fulfilled. It helps me to think about this like we do when we are in a relationship with a loved one. Healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries must be put into place to ensure that the needs and the promises of each party or individual are being met and upheld. The accountability is put into place along with the provisions, but of course, with licensees, it's a legal agreement. At the end of the day, we can control ourselves and our choices, even those that we extend to others within the limits of the law. And we can support and encourage the choices of others, but only they can take action on whether to agree to those terms or not. And we, in response, take action as well. So now that we've discussed how to start with heart, let's take a moment to focus on how to trust your gut. First, let's be sure to acknowledge this part that must always accompany our gut, and that is we must analyze the data. So it's analyze the data and trust your gut. What I mean here is use your professional judgment. You are the professionals who have the skills, experience, and insight necessary to make decisions that a robot simply cannot and never will be able to. So use them wisely. We really need you. When we take time to analyze the data present in a specific case, we gain insight to the patterns and risk probability of specific violations. When we couple this analysis with the patterns of knowledge, skills and abilities, and behaviors and other characteristics we have observed within our relationship within a licensee, it should empower us to feel confident when we trust our gut to help us make an informed decision using our professional judgment. In our strong licensing paper, we provide some examples of the need for the agency to evaluate specific situations and to use professional judgment. And we also include some cautionary notes on the use of progressive enforcement systems. Even with the most restrictive terminal sanctions, the agency still has an obligation and an opportunity to use its professional judgment. For example, in the course of forcible closure actions, the licensee may offer a settlement agreement in lieu of closure. The agency may entertain the offer, negotiate more acceptable conditions, or accept the offer. The agency must evaluate the immediacy of risk to children, as well as the capability and sincerity of the licensee in deciding whether to accept or to decline. So we see how important it is, not only the data are relative to this case, but also the relationship the licensor has with the provider. How else will the licensor determine capability and sincerity if not to take personal elements into consideration along with the data and use professional judgment? That having been said, it is critically important that the licensing agency ensures that both licensees and licensors fully understand that the use of a continuum of progressively severe responses does not commit the agency to use them stepwise. So for example, one single incident may give evidence of a failure in judgment and responsibility so egregious that the agency cannot responsibly consider intermediate sanctions. A licensing agency has both the right and the responsibility to move directly to forcible closure action when providers are unable or unwilling to comply with requirements designed to protect the health, safety, and developmental well-being of children. Similarly, the system must be designed and communicated as a way to structure the process for more consistent exercise of professional judgment and decision-making at the organizational level. However, it is not intended, nor is it feasible, to try to replace professional judgment with a rigid formula. For example, if violations are weighted to determined amounts for fiscal sanctions, point ranges should tie to penalty brackets. This will increase decision consistency and transparency while also allowing the decision makers some latitude, although narrowed, to take into account the different case circumstances typically found in real life cases, such as the history, attitudes, patterns, contributing circumstances, and the like. You know, I think we have covered a lot of ground together today. So let's go ahead and ask ourselves, what have we learned? When thinking about balancing technical assistance and enforcement as part of a strong licensing foundation, we can use this model as one way to think about how we might add teachable moments and to ensure best practices throughout various types of enforcement actions. We can give ourselves and our licensees enough grace to establish healthy relationships together and to use our professional judgment in our decision-making. We can start with heart and trust your gut. You can ensure that you and your staff are adequately prepared and equipped to prevent children from harm and to promote their healthy development. And if you're ever wondering how to motivate and support a licensee to generate her own solutions to remedy an issue, remember my story and go for the win-win. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your thoughtful presentation. We certainly appreciate your expertise and the heart that you brought into the information that you shared. Now we want to take some time to respond to the questions from the audience. And so we're going to take a look at what we have had come in so far. And one of these comments actually relates to how you mentioned the variety of different settings. And one of the things that was brought up related to that was, how do we ensure that licensors themselves are familiar with all of the necessary settings to understand the various needs of safety and development across different groups? For example, a setting for only 10 to 12-year-old school-age children in a middle school versus infants, etc. Certainly would love to hear from Amy on that. Would love to hear from any of the other attendees that maybe have developed training programs for your licensors on a variety of age-based settings or policies and practices that you use. So we're going to give everybody a chance and give Amy a moment to respond. If you all have questions or comments related to Amy's presentation, you can go ahead and share those in the chat box as well.
Thank you for your questions. What I can tell you is what comes to mind when I think about the myriad of different types of settings and different age groups and ways in which children are grouped together. I have to acknowledge there's no one right way, right? There's no one right answer. It's like children. You know, we don't have a parenting handbook because every child is different, every family is different, parent is different, and yet there are similarities, hence child development. So I will tell you one strategy. It may not work where you're sitting, but work well for us in Virginia, worked well for us in Alabama, worked well for us in North Carolina, and it worked well for us in Washington State. Was there were a variety of ways in which different providers and licensors or someone representing the licensing agency, as well as any quality initiatives taking place on the local level, could participate together. And I understand, I saw just briefly because I was presenting this, but I saw some comments coming in about time. I agree 100%. Time is critical. We don't always have copious amounts of time, especially now. And yet, if you can come up with a system where one representative, if it's from your entire agency, if it's from your specific local community, can represent your licensing office and attend regularly scheduled meetings with a variety of different providers. If there is a forum where they are welcomed, listening and asking questions there, I think provides an incredible amount of insight. That's how I learned a lot of what I know, which isn't true for every single person on the planet, but it worked well where I was sitting on the local level as well as the state level, asking the providers themselves and asking them to share their experiences with you and to share their questions gives us insight and really actually helps my heart, understand where they're coming from. So if I don't have personal direct experience in that environment, certainly we can ask other licensing staff who might, but I feel like making sure that we hear from the providers themselves, even if it's like one rep from your agency or your local office, and then sharing that information broadly may help us better understand where they're coming from. And with regard to the different groups of children, again, asking the different providers and or directors, depending on the setting, how they do it and how it works for them and what their challenges are, then we become the experts of, okay, we know what the requirements say. How do we make this work? Is the intent of the requirement being met? Are the kids healthy and safe? Okay, there's an opportunity for grace because we can look at how do we work this out together. So I don't think that anyone has all the answers, for definitely not me, but that is one recommendation for a strategy that might help us gain some insight, just listening to the voices who actually represent themselves.
Thanks so much, Amy. I do want to point out a comment that just came in this because I wanted to be sure you saw it. And someone noted that the focus on relationship, grace, heart, and trusting your gut is refreshing. So I think that really resonated with everyone today. And I just wanted to point that out. We do have a question related to your specific story that you shared where you had the licensor that spent a long time in your facility when you were a new center director. She asked whether or not the supervision was cited as a violation, and your answer was the corrective action, or was it technical assistance without a violation?
Great question. And I actually was trying to rack my brain. I don't want to reveal too much time here, but let me just say a few decades, or at least a couple, might have passed. I believe that there was a citation, hence the tears. And I'll tell you, I did cry like a baby when she left because I felt like I had let my staff down. I felt like I had let the kids down. And actually, it was not egregious. So they were fine. They were healthy. They were safe. But it was a learning opportunity for me. So I did come up with a corrective action plan just in how we were going to make that happen. There was a violation. But it wasn't the end of the world. I didn't have to pay a fine. We weren't shut down, nothing like that, because clearly the kids really were healthy and safe, but we did need to correct that problem right away. And in the meantime, I had to make sure that what just simply wasn't allowed. No kid was going to walk down that hallway by him or herself at all, ever. If you have to take 8 kids with you in a line and start singing a song and, going through whatever at the time and teach them how to march or something creative for some other types of development while they're waiting, so be it. But nobody's going to be unsupervised. And I learned that lesson very well.
Thanks so much. There are quite a few questions with folks asking about the slide deck in your presentation. And so I just want to reassure everyone, and I will mention this again too at closing, that we will, when we post the recording to our website, we will also have a PDF version of the slide deck available so that you'll be able to reference all of the intricacies of the revised pyramid that was shared. Everyone that registered for the webinar, we will send out information with the link to where that is posted once that has gone through the remediation process and is available. So just wanted to reassure everyone that was asking about the slide deck that those will be available as well. Another question just came in and they are asking if you can share some additional thoughts and measurable steps on how to change the culture of a licensing division to embrace these concepts.
Sorry, it took me a second. I'm writing them down too, because I love your questions. I learned just as much from you as you're hopefully also learning from me, right? It's a mutual process. So thank you for sharing these with me. Well, it starts with leadership. And I mean, I have been, starting at, I don't want to say the bottom, but I've been in a position where I was supporting. And then I've also been in a position where I was able to make a great deal of decisions. And, we actually had a number of different opportunities to change our culture, some for the better. And we had a lot of, frankly, tension in a government merger that took place in Washington State, where I was many years ago. I can't see who's on, but I hope, my friends from Washington are there. And I feel like, there are a variety of different ways, but getting an objective third party to come in as a consultant to help bridge the gap, if there is a gap between leadership and line staff or policy staff, wherever it is, if there's some friction and tension, you can have a consultant come in to help try to establish a better rapport where you can get everyone moving on a renewed vision and the same page. You can certainly reach out to NARA and look at how they might be able to support you, in terms of their best practices. I know that one thing we did within our Department of Early Learning in Washington State was actually go through and use the NARA best practices and competencies for licensors and indicators. Oh, Jeff, hi, Virginia. Those are my people too. Lots of people, lots of places. And it was an opportunity for us to use a systematic methodological way to reflect on ourselves as a team. So therefore, it's not just pinned on one person, like, oh yeah, she's the softie. She wants us to all get along. Yes, I know. I've been accused of that. Yeah, you're right. I am. I do want us to get along. I think it's possible. I'm not going to give up. And then, but it's a tool. So it's not just my opinion and your opinion, but it's how can we objectively reflect on the practices that are occurring and whether and how they fit with the policy. And if you're talking about, okay, we've got practices down, we've got policy down, but it's in the how they're delivered, the tone isn't there. There are also ways that you can create within licensing. I'm assuming you probably do some sort of feedback card. If you don't, I hope that you figure out a way, or actually nowadays it can be automated, but where you give the providers an opportunity every year to provide feedback. They might say, they might not have data points based on observable behavior, but their perception might be, my licensor is so mean. Okay, tell us more about that. Why? What is it? What do you wish was different? How? And then another thing, so that's like coming from licensees themselves. Then another thing that I helped promote within our department was the licensing staff themselves. And what I say this with my kids too. I don't mind if you have a complaint and you identify a problem, but I also want you to propose a solution. So what is it that you observe? So I would line up the data, like literally list dates and times of what you've observed. There's X, Y, Z going on, if it's about yourself or colleagues or licensees or whatever you're observing. Demonstrate the pattern using those data. So you're going to analyze, you're using your professional judgment, you're trusting your gut. And then you're starting with heart by saying, I believe there's an issue. This is what I think it is. I recommend that we promote X, Y, and Z. And here's at least one way that can happen. Now you're being thoughtful in why. You're not just complaining. You're saying there's a problem and I want to be part of the solution. And that's what we're talking about.
Great. Thanks, Amy. I think too, as you were talking, and I noticed some comments earlier as well, and you mentioned the word tone, and I often think about that as well from a licensor's perspective, but many of the folks in the chat, some of the comments have mentioned that even if it's a tough visit, they certainly like to leave with something positive. And I think that certainly goes a long way with the providers. And so I think that resonates with a lot of folks on the line. I do want to point out as well that we have dropped the link in the chat to the NARA licensing site, which is where the strong licensing paper that Amy and colleagues wrote. So that's there for reference for everyone that you can download. One of the other questions that came in, Amy, was when you say grace, is that similar to discretion?
Great. I'm gonna unmute myself. That's an excellent question. I mean, I guess it is how we operationalize it, right? A word can have many different meanings. I guess what I'm saying is things are not always black and white, and there's a gray in between. So when we think about tone, let's think about color, and that is, okay, this is what it says, this is what I see. Okay, you're wrong. You're terrible. You're not meeting the requirement. You have a violation. Go check it out. Here's a website. Goodbye. Okay, that would be doing your job, right? I mean, you're saying here are the requirements. You didn't meet it. You got to do it. So then with the tone, there's also this color. And I see that Christy included in the chat, assume good intentions. And that's actually a great way to navigate life. I mean, not everyone is going to reciprocate. But if we put it out there, there's a greater likelihood that it's going to come back. So discretion, when you say that in terms of grace, discretion, I'm not sure exactly what you mean there. It could be that you're holding it confidential in terms of not sharing, with your colleagues, but it doesn't mean you're going to look the other way. So I don't ever want to imply that. We're not looking the other way, but we are looking for opportunities to say, okay, is there a gray area? If there is, why? In terms of children and how they're going to be kept safe and developing well. So for example, in my situation, it was like, a few minutes where kids were not being seen. That's unacceptable. And she knew that. Now she could have said, oh, I'm not going to cite you, but you got to do this today. But, she didn't. I'm glad she didn't, because I took it very literally, and I knew it was important, very seriously. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Amy. And I also want to say thank you. I noticed throughout the presentation as well, there was some sharing going on between participants and sharing some links and things. Here's a general personal question. They wanted to know if you went to graduate school at Auburn, Amy, because you look familiar.
Oh, who is that? Who is that?
Hannah Presley.
Oh my goodness. Hi, Hannah. Oh, yes. And Hannah, if I think you are who I believe you are, you were one of my students. It's great to see you. I'm glad you're here.
Great to make those connections. We do have a couple of more moments. If anyone else has any comments or questions for Amy. It's always fun to have those personal connections. Give everybody just a moment. Not seeing any more come in. Oh, here we go. We've got another one. It says, do you consider corrective action a negative action?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't. I think it's an opportunity to correct what was wrong. And with the right coaching, someone wrote in there a moment ago, I think I saw a name, Christina, maybe, with the right coaching and resources given, it's like, okay, this can't ever happen again. Propose to me how. I don't think it's negative. I think it's actually coaching. I myself have to do that. Those of us who are on the division level or on the, whatever it is, the teams that we're leading, whether out in the field or in an operations office or policy, whatever it is, we also have to report to whoever is in charge of us, right? And let me tell you, as an agency, we had to do that for the governor. We had quarterly meetings, government management and accountability plans. When our agency had to do a corrective action plan, it wasn't that we were, bad, or it was just that whatever we were doing wasn't working well in terms of the established law and requirements in place. And so we had to figure out a way to fix it. I don't think it's negative as long as it's delivered with grace.
Someone else has noted as well that they understand that you're using the term grace, and they're wondering if that is really also tying to professional standard for interpersonal conduct. So in other words, using active listening, being empathetic, those types of things.
Absolutely, yes. And I like the way you describe that, Elaine. Yeah, I agree. Also, for any of you who might have gone through, oh shoot, I just lost it. Sorry, I'm very tired. But Crucial Conversations. Crucial Conversations, it's a coaching program where you're constantly in conflicted situations, and you are using that active listening and those interpersonal skills and empathy. And they actually use, and I promise I didn't copy, but later I realized, oh, start with heart. They use that. They actually use that too, because using the data and using those interpersonal connections, assuming the best of intentions, and actively listening, as you say, is how you're going to get from that beginning point to some sort of a mutual understanding together. Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Another question that came in, and it may be great food for thought for all of us as we think about this further. And it actually ties into the next professional development session, which is going to focus on equity and implicit bias. But they say, I love the updated triangle. How do we look at equity within the triangle, and how do we call attention to it?
I'm glad you asked that question. Is that Alicia? Yeah. I thought about that. You know, I know it's not the focus of our presentation, but I did think about that just because of other conversations I'm engaged in as well. And I thought, what is it about, you know, is it a bias that we have not yet identified within ourselves? What parts that are called out within the triangle might that be affecting, and how can we be aware of that ourselves as individuals? I think that type of training, professional development, like the next session that Amy talked about, would be a great way to think about how do we incorporate that together from an individual perspective, and then you can look at it organizationally as well.
Great. Great. We appreciate the additional comments coming in. If you have additional questions beyond the webinar, we will have an email address at the end of the presentation too, where you can send additional questions. We do have a request to go back and show the updated triangle slide again. So if we could, Tatiana, I believe maybe you're controlling the slides. If you don't mind backing up, there we go to Amy's closing slide there. Angela, is there a particular question regarding the triangle slide, or just wanted to reference it again? Not seeing an additional question come in, so feel free to definitely. Wonderful, thank you, great. And again, the slide deck will be shared when we post the recording as well. And so with that, Amy, I think what we're going to do is just ask people to continue to put questions in if they have that we can maybe follow up on, and they can always email us afterwards. But we just want to thank you again so much for your expertise and your time this afternoon sharing with everyone. I do have a couple of closing things that we want to go through. So if we can go ahead and advance to the next couple of slides. We really want to take some time for all of you to be able to respond to some questions that we have for feedback, because we really want to hear from you about how today's session went in preparation and planning for the additional 2 sessions that we have planned for this fiscal year. So on your screen, you can see that we have a QR code that you can use your mobile device to access a feedback form. And then also in the chat box, we will be dropping the link that you see there on the screen, where you can access the survey in another browser on your website. So please take a moment to go ahead and begin responding to that feedback form if you can. Again, you can use the QR code that's shown there with your mobile device. And we're getting some additional thanks in the chat box, so we'll drop the link directly to the feedback form one more time as well, so it's handy. Thank you, Shannon. It's great. I'm going to give just a moment for everyone to be able to access that before we have a couple of other closing slides with some additional information for everyone. So I'll take just a moment for everybody to get started on that. Thank you so much for everyone that is responding. If you haven't had a chance to fully complete the feedback form, it will remain open following the call to allow additional time for you to respond fully. For those of you that attended the live session today, we will be sending out certificates of participation in the coming days. The certificates will be generated based on the registration information and the email address that you provided at the time of registration. Due to the great number of participants that we had, as well as the upcoming holiday, it might take a little bit of time for processing of all of the certificates, but we will distribute them just as soon as possible. And again, the recording of today's session along with the remediated slide deck will be posted, and as soon as they are available, we will send out an announcement to the group of registrants from today's webinar so that you'll have the direct link on where to access them and locate them. And we'd like to take a moment to share information about some other upcoming events focusing on licensing. 2 weeks from today, on December 2nd, there will be a licensing community of practice that will really be a wonderful opportunity to extend today's discussion around the topic of balancing technical assistance and enforcement. It will be a first in a series of community of practice sessions that the National Center on Early Childhood Quality Assurance will host this year, focusing on topical issues facing agencies working with and monitoring licensed providers. So please do plan to join us for those conversations with your colleagues from across the country. We'll be sharing information on current trends and issues facing the field. A link for this first community is posted in the chat box. And then in the new year, on January 20th, the first of the license exempt monitoring community of practices will be held. The discussion for that particular session will focus on CCDF standards and monitoring requirements specific to license exempt population. We really encourage those of you that work specifically with license exempt providers to join us for that discussion as well. And the registration link for that will also be in the chat box. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Once again, we want to thank everyone for joining us today. Very special thanks again to Dr. Amie Lapp Payne for the fantastic presentation she shared. We hope to see all of you again for session 2 of the professional development series. It's being planned for February, so please watch for upcoming details on that. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we wish everyone a safe and happy holiday next week. Thank you so much. Take care.